What happens when one of the sharpest comedians in the world sits down with a host who refuses to let anyone else have the last word? In just 34 seconds, a casual conversation turned into one of the most explosive moments in talk show history, ending with a guest being thrown off set in front of millions of viewers. Ricky Gervais walked onto the set that night expecting a normal interview. He had done hundreds of these before. Talk about his comedy, share a few laughs, promote his latest project, and head home. Simple, easy, but what he got instead was something completely different. Something that would spiral out of control faster than anyone could have predicted. Piers Morgan sat across from him with that familiar smirk, the kind of look that said he was already planning his next interruption, the kind of look that made guests nervous before they even opened their mouths. But Ricky was not the type to get nervous. He had faced tougher crowds than this. He had hosted award shows where he roasted the most powerful people in entertainment. A talk show host was nothing. The studio lights were bright, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Piers' show, Piers Morgan Uncensored, was known for its confrontational style. Guests grilled, opinions clashed, ratings soared on controversy. Tonight's episode was live on Talk TV, streaming worldwide, with millions tuned in via YouTube and social feeds. Ricky, fresh off his latest Netflix special critiquing woke culture and celebrity hypocrisy, was the perfect bait. Piers had teased the interview all week. Ricky Gervais finally faces real questions. No holding back. They shook hands, firm, but Piers' grip lingered a second too long, like he was asserting dominance from the jump. Ricky Gervais, ladies and gentlemen, Piers announced, milking the applause. Ricky waved modestly, settling into the guest chair, legs crossed, utterly relaxed. The interview started normally enough. Piers asked about Ricky's career, his comedy specials, his thoughts on cancel culture. Standard questions. Ricky answered with his usual mix of honesty and humor. Cancel culture, it's just accountability with a mob mentality. Ricky quipped. The audience laughed. Everything seemed fine, but then Piers started to push. He always did this. It was his style. Ask a question, then talk over the answer. Make a statement, then act offended when someone disagreed. And tonight, he was in rare form. You know what your problem is, Piers said, leaning forward with that condescending tone he loved to use. You think you're smarter than everyone else in the room. Ricky laughed. Not a fake laugh, a genuine one, because the irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Here was Piers Morgan, a man who interrupted his own guests to hear himself talk, accusing someone else of thinking they were the smartest person in the room. That's rich coming from you, Ricky said, still smiling. Mate, you've spent your entire career telling people what to think. The audience made that collective ooh sound, the kind that happens when someone lands a good blow in a verbal sparring match. Piers did not like that. You could see it in his face, the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes narrowed just a fraction. He was used to being the one who delivered the zingers, not the one receiving them. I'm a journalist, Piers shot back, his voice rising slightly. I ask the tough questions. I hold people accountable. That's my job, right? Ricky said, nodding slowly. And how did that work out at that tabloid you used to run? You know, before all that phone hacking stuff came out. The studio went quiet, dead quiet, because Ricky had just touched on something that Piers definitely did not want to talk about, something that had followed him for years, the news of the world scandal, phone hacking, invasions of privacy, celebrities and royals victimized under Piers' editorship. He had denied direct knowledge, but the stain lingered. Piers shifted in his seat. We're not talking about that, he said quickly, trying to regain control. We're talking about you and your comedy. No, Ricky said calmly. You brought up credibility. You brought up holding people accountable. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the journalists who hacked phones and invaded people's privacy. Let's talk about that. That has nothing to do with this interview, Piers said, his voice getting louder now. He was flustered. Anyone watching could see it. The confident host who always had a comeback was scrambling. It has everything to do with this interview, Ricky replied. You're sitting here acting like you're some moral authority, but your own past is questionable at best. You want to judge everyone else, but you can't handle being judged yourself. The audience was completely silent now. This had gone from a playful back and forth to something much more intense, much more real. Piers was gripping the armrest of his chair. His face was turning red. You could practically see the steam coming out of his ears. "You don't know what you're talking about," Piers said through gritted teeth. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Ricky said, "and so does everyone watching. That's what bothers you. Not that I'm saying it, but that everyone knows it's true." Let's rewind even further, because the tension had been simmering from the very first question. Piers hadn't started with the softballs out of kindness. It was set up. He wanted Ricky comfortable before dropping the hammer. "Welcome to the show, Ricky. You've hosted the Golden Globes multiple times, roasting Hollywood's elite. Do you ever worry that your comedy goes too far? That maybe you cross lines that shouldn't be crossed?" It was a loaded question, the kind designed to put Ricky on the defensive, to make him explain himself, to justify his art to someone who had already decided it was offensive. Ricky recognized it immediately. He had been asked versions of this question hundreds of times before. "No," he said simply, "I don't worry about that at all." Piers raised his eyebrows, clearly expecting more, waiting for Ricky to elaborate, to fill the silence. But Ricky just sat there, comfortable in the pause, letting Piers squirm. "That's it," Piers finally said, "just no." "What else do you want me to say?" Ricky asked. "You asked if I worry about it. I don't. I think about it, sure. I'm thoughtful about my comedy, but worry, no, because I know where my line is. I know what I'm trying to say, and if other people don't get it, that's their problem, not mine." "But don't you have a responsibility?" Piers pressed. "As someone with a platform, as someone with influence, a responsibility to whom?" Ricky shot back. "To you, to people who are never going to find me funny anyway. My responsibility is to be honest, to say what I actually think, not to make everyone comfortable." "So, you don't care if you offend people?" "I didn't say that. I said I don't worry about crossing lines. Those are two different things, of course. I care about people's feelings. I'm not a psychopath. But I also refuse to let the most sensitive person in the room decide what everyone else is allowed to laugh at." Piers leaned forward, sensing an opening. "But who decides what is okay to joke about? Who gets to make that call? The person telling the joke?" Ricky said without hesitation. "That's how comedy works. That's how free speech works. You say something, people react, and then we all move on with our lives. Nobody dies. Nobody goes to prison. We just continue existing. But some things should not be joked about," Piers insisted, his voice taking on that righteous tone. "Some topics are too serious, too painful, too important." "According to whom?" Ricky asked. "According to you. See, that's the problem with your whole argument. You want to be the arbiter of what's acceptable. You want to decide where the line is, but you don't get to do that. Nobody does. That's not how this works." The audience started clapping. Not everyone, but enough that it was noticeable, enough that Piers definitely heard it, and that bothered him. You could see it, the slight twitch in his jaw, the way he glanced toward the crowd with barely concealed annoyance. "I'm not trying to be an arbiter of anything," Piers said defensively. "I'm just saying that there are things that most reasonable people would agree are off limits." "Name one," Ricky challenged. Piers paused. He had not expected to be put on the spot like this. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence stretched out for several uncomfortable seconds. 5, 10, 15. The director in the control room was probably sweating. Live TV hates dead air. "Well," he finally said, "I think we can all agree that mocking someone's disability is cruel and unnecessary." "Sure," Ricky agreed. "If you're actually mocking someone's disability to hurt them, that's cruel. But what if you're making a joke about society's reaction to disability? What if you're challenging people's assumptions? What if you're using humor to make a larger point about discrimination and prejudice? Is that still off limits? It depends on how you do it," Piers said, trying to regain his footing. "Exactly," Ricky said, pointing at him. It depends on context, on intention, on execution, which means there are no hard and fast rules, which means you can't just draw a line and say nothing on this side is acceptable. Comedy is nuanced, it's complicated, and people like you want to make it simple because simple is easier to control. People like me, Piers repeated, his voice rising. What is that supposed to mean? People who think they should be in charge of what everyone else thinks and says and does. Ricky explained. People who can't stand the idea that someone might have a different opinion. People who dress up their desire for control as concern for others. That was when Piers first stood up from his chair. Not the final time. This was earlier, before things got truly heated. He stood up and started pacing like he could not contain his frustration sitting down. I find it fascinating, Piers said, his voice dripping with condescension, that you of all people are lecturing me about control. You who throws a tantrum whenever anyone criticizes your work. You who blocks people on social media for disagreeing with you. You want to talk about not being able to handle different opinions. Ricky laughed again, that same genuine laugh, because Piers had just walked right into another trap. Mate, Ricky said, blocking someone on Twitter is not the same as trying to get them fired or trying to silence them or trying to stop them from working. I'm allowed to curate my own social media experience. That's not censorship. That's just not wanting to hear from idiots all day. There's a difference. So anyone who criticizes you is an idiot. Piers asked, thinking he had caught Ricky in a contradiction. No, Ricky said patiently, like he was explaining something to a child. People who criticize me thoughtfully and intelligently are fine. I can handle that. I welcome that. But people who just hurl insults or make bad faith arguments or deliberately misrepresent what I said, yeah, I don't need that in my life. And neither do you, by the way. I've seen your Twitter feed. You block people all the time. That's different. Piers protested. How? Ricky asked. How is it different when you do it? Piers did not have an answer for that. He just stood there, mouth slightly open, caught in his own hypocrisy. The audience could sense it, too. They were fully on Ricky's side now. Every time he made a point, there were nods and murmurs of agreement, and that's when Piers made his fatal mistake. The moment where he could have laughed it off, admitted he was being a bit hypocritical, and moved on. The moment where he could have salvaged the interview and his dignity, but instead he doubled down. The difference, Piers said slowly, his voice hard, is that I actually matter. I am a real journalist. I have broken major stories. I have interviewed world leaders. You are just a comedian, someone who tells jokes for a living. So when I block someone, it's because I don't have time for nonsense. When you block someone, it's because you can't handle criticism. The studio went absolutely silent because what Piers had just said was so arrogant, so dismissive, so blatantly disrespectful that even his own audience was stunned. You could have heard a pin drop. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Ricky sat there for a long moment just looking at Piers. His expression was unreadable, and then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. Not a friendly smile, a smile that said, "Game over, you just lost. You think you're better than me." Ricky said quietly, "It was not a question, it was a statement. You genuinely believe that what you do is more important than what I do, that journalism, or whatever you want to call what you do, is somehow more valuable than comedy." "It is," Piers said flatly. "Comedy is entertainment. Journalism is truth." "Truth," Ricky repeated, his voice incredulous. "You want to talk about truth. Let's talk about all the times you've been wrong. All the times you've printed stories that weren't true. All the times you've had to retract things or apologize or quietly edit articles. You act like you're some guardian of truth, but your track record is spotty at best. Everyone makes mistakes," Piers said defensively. "Right. Everyone makes mistakes, including comedians. But when I make a mistake, I just told a bad joke. When you make a mistake, you ruin someone's life. You print lies. You destroy reputations. So maybe get off your high horse before you lecture me about the importance of what you do." Piers was shaking now, actually shaking with anger. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His face was bright red. He looked like he might explode at any second. "How dare you?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. "How dare you come on my show and speak to me like this?" "How dare I?" Ricky said, standing up now too. They were face to face, separated only by the coffee table between them. "You are the one who invited me here. You are the one who started throwing insults. You are the one who said I don't matter, so don't act surprised when I push back. This is my show." Piers practically growled, "Mine. And I will not be disrespected in front of my own audience." "Then maybe you should not disrespect your guests," Ricky said calmly. "Maybe you should treat people with the same respect you expect from them." "Wild concept, I know." Piers stood up suddenly. The movement was so abrupt that it startled everyone in the studio. He pointed at Ricky, his finger shaking slightly. "I will not sit here and be disrespected on my own show," he said, his voice booming now, "by you or anyone else." Ricky stayed seated, calm, unfazed. He looked up at Piers with an expression that was almost pitying. "Mate," he said softly, "I haven't disrespected you. I've just refused to pretend that you are something you are not. There's a difference." That was it. That was the moment, the exact second where Piers Morgan completely lost control. He turned to someone off camera and made a gesture, a sharp, angry gesture. Within seconds, two producers rushed onto the set. They looked confused, glancing between Piers and Ricky, not quite sure what was happening. "Get him out of here," Piers said, his voice shaking with rage. "Get him off my set now." The producers hesitated. You could see it on their faces. This was live television. Millions of people were watching. Throwing a guest off the show mid-interview was not something that happened, Dever. But Piers was not backing down. "I said, get him out," he shouted. Ricky stood up slowly, brushing off his jacket. He did not look angry. He did not look upset. If anything, he looked amused, like this was exactly what he expected to happen, like Piers had just proven every single point he had been making. "Well," Ricky said, looking directly at the camera, "I guess we know who the real snowflake is, don't we?" The audience erupted. Some people were laughing. Others were gasping. A few were even applauding. It was chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos. And Piers Morgan was standing in the middle of it, red-faced and furious, watching as his show fell apart around him. "Out!" he screamed again, pointing toward the exit. Ricky started walking toward the side of the stage, but he was taking his time, strolling really, like he was out for a casual walk in the park. The producers were beside him, not quite sure if they should be escorting him or just following along. Whole thing looked absurd. As he reached the edge of the stage, Ricky turned back one last time. "Thanks for having me, Piers," he called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "This has been absolutely delightful." And then he was gone off the stage, out of the studio, leaving Piers Morgan standing there alone, trying desperately to compose himself in front of a live audience and millions of viewers at home. Piers walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. He ran a hand through his hair, took a deep breath, and looked into the camera. You could see him trying to gather his thoughts, trying to figure out what to say next, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of what had just happened. "Well," he finally said, his voice still shaky, "that was unfortunate." Ricky Gervais, ladies and gentlemen, a man who clearly cannot handle a real conversation. But nobody was buying it. The audience was not buying it. The viewers at home were not buying it, because everyone had just watched the same thing unfold. Everyone had seen who lost control, who started shouting, who threw someone off their show because they could not handle being challenged. Piers tried to move on. He introduced the next segment, talking about some celebrity gossip story that nobody cared about, but the energy was gone. The show was dead. He was just going through the motions, now counting down the minutes until he could get off the air. The clock on the wall ticked past the 20-minute mark since Ricky had walked on set. What was meant to be a 15-minute segment had ballooned into a full-blown spectacle. Backstage, producers scrambled. Phones buzzing with network execs, PR teams drafting statements. Social media exploded. Piers' meltdown trended worldwide within minutes. Clips of Ricky's mic drop lines went viral, racking up tens of millions of views. But let's linger on the build-up, because those first 19 minutes and 26 seconds were a masterclass in escalating tension. After the disability joke debate, Piers pivoted to Ricky's atheism. Another hot button. You're an outspoken atheist. Piers said, you mock religion constantly. Don't you think that's punching down at billions of believers? Punching down, Ricky echoed. Religion isn't a person, it's an idea, and bad ideas should be challenged. If God exists, he can take a joke. The audience chuckled nervously. Piers smirked. But you're so smug about it. Like you're the enlightened one. Smug, mate, I've got nothing on the people who claim to know the mind of the universe's creator. That's smug. Piers interrupted. See, this is what I mean. You can't just answer without insulting. I'm not insulting believers. I'm insulting the absurdity of believing in talking snakes and virgin births in 2025. More laughs. Piers' smile faded. He shifted to cancel culture again. You've been canceled yourself. Petitions to fire you from projects. How does that feel? I haven't been canceled. I'm richer and more popular than ever. Cancellation is a myth perpetuated by people who want to play victim. You called trans activists weirdos in your special. I called compelled speech weird. If you want to live as the opposite sex, fine, but don't compel me to play along with pronouns or I'll joke about it. Piers pounced. So trans people are fair game. Everyone's fair game in comedy. That's the point. Equality means equal roasting. The pacing example earlier wasn't isolated. Piers stood multiple times, gesturing wildly, voice booming over the studio speakers. Ricky remained seated, sipping water, delivering barbs with precision. Then came the personal digs. Piers brought up Ricky's wealth. You're a multimillionaire lecturing about inequality. I'm an ex-office worker who got lucky. You're a tabloid king who hacked grieving families' phones. Another hush. Piers alleged, and I resigned honorably. Honorably. You oversaw a culture of it. This looped back to the phone hacking climax, the 34-second explosion that ended it all. In the aftermath, as the show limped to commercial, Piers muttered off, "Mike, but picked up by hot mics, arrogant prick." The feed cut, but not before it leaked online. Ricky, outside, tweeted from his phone, "Great chat with Piers. He really held me accountable to leaving. Free speech for me, but not for thee." By morning, analysts dissected every minute. Psychologists called it narcissistic injury. Piers' ego shattered on live TV. Comedians hailed Ricky as a hero. Piers issued a statement, "I stand by removing disruptive guests." Gervais crossed lines, but the damage was done. Ratings spiked, but Piers' reputation cratered further. Ricky's special surged in streams. This wasn't just an interview, it was a demolition. Piers wanted to expose Ricky as arrogant. Instead, he exposed himself, a bully who crumbles without control. Ricky walked out a legend, calm, witty, victorious, and in those full 20 minutes of build-up and 34 seconds of chaos, the world saw truth. Comedy can eviscerate hypocrisy faster than any tough question. Piers got his viral moment, just not the one he wanted.